It's Dr. Sabrina Siegel here with a special series brought to you by the NEI Podcast. Welcome to the PsychopharmaStahlogy Show. In this special series, Dr. Andrew Cutler interviews Dr. Stephen Stahl on the most controversial, novel, and exciting topics in psychopharmacology today. Every 3 months, we will address a different theme in psychopharmacology. Each theme is split into 3 parts with 1 part released each month. The next theme is on the future of psychopharmacology. This theme focuses on the updated 5th edition of Stahl's Essential Psychopharmacology, the 5E video series, effective strategies for learning about psychopharmacology, and what's on the horizon for the field. Let's listen in to part 2, the 5th edition video series and how to implement the best learning strategies for understanding psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the PsychopharmaStahlogy Show, our podcast series from NEI featuring the one and only Dr. Stephen Stahl. This edition is part 2 of a 3-part series that is looking at the latest version of Stahl's Essentials of Psychopharmacology, the 5th edition. And what we're going to be talking about in today's podcast is the 5th edition video series that was made from the textbook and how to implement best learning strategies for understanding psychopharmacology. And with me today is the one and the only, the man himself, Dr. Stephen Stahl. How are you, Steve?
Whoa, Andy, what an introduction. I'm fine.
Great. Well, Steve, it's very interesting here. People are always trying to incorporate new technologies and new ways of learning and teaching. What was the impetus behind the idea of doing a video version of the book?
Well, the impetus has to do with how people learn. And it's the 25th anniversary of the 5th edition of the book. And so we thought we would ever more modify it so that, people can do it online, essentially. And a lot of people listen and would rather do things on demand, not when somebody's teaching it in a course, and also would rather see somebody talking to them in a video than read a book. So other people just would like to go through it in different ways, the same material. So we decided, in fact, if I had known it had been the project that it was, I'm not sure I would have done it because it took a lot more time and effort than I really anticipated. But what we decided to do is faithfully follow the text. So you could actually open the book and go through it actually while I'm talking, and every figure is mentioned and shown in a slide and discussed in order, and no extra slides are put in. And we cut it off at about 30 minutes. Maybe some go to 40. Most people don't want to go a full hour because if you have an hour between patients or something, and you don't want to go to 60 minutes, you want to have about a half hour or so. So we tried to do it in bite-sized proportions and just to have another way to go through the same material.
So I understand that the book has 13 chapters. Is that right? And how many
That is right.
lectures? Yeah, how many lectures did you film?
Well, I believe we kind of put it down into like 20 lectures. So that means some chapters get 2 lectures because they were too long. And so, once you had 30, 35 minutes, we just cut it. So we tried to find a break point in the larger chapters. Psychosis is a big chapter. Mood's a big chapter. Mm-hmm. And so we cut those in half. And so the whole thing, in fact, it leads to the amount of CME you can get. So the most important thing is learning it, but other people are interested in killing 2 birds with 1 stone. As you know, and has been the history of this book, it has a lot of CME just by going through the book and taking the book tests. Mm-hmm. In fact, this one's rated now at 61.5 hours of CME credits for the book on 13 chapters. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to do the whole book. You can do it per therapeutic area and just do, 1 or 2 and call it a day. Mm-hmm. But if you watch the videos and take the video test, that's 18 and a quarter or 3/4 or maybe 20 in that range hours of additional CME. So the book plus the videos, if you do that, it's like 80 hours of CME plus.
My goodness. That's a very efficient way to get your CMEs.
We hope so. And the other thing is that the videos, you don't have to listen to the whole thing. Mm-hmm. If you look at the way in which it's put up on the NEI website it's in the members portal, you can just look at small sections that might be 3 to 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And so we break down the 35-minute thing into that. So it can also be good for teachers who actually just want to say, well, you want to know how GABA works? Well, go to the GABA 5, slides in chapter X and just listen to it. It takes 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's an easy way to go through a very narrow subject quickly and just have to find it and listen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you answered one of my questions. I was going to ask, how does somebody access these videos? And it sounds like you said you need to be an NEI member to get to the member section. Is that right?
That's right. It's part of the member portal, and it's a benefit. It's a free benefit for people who are NEI members. But of course, NEI membership does have a fee.
So what's interesting there, Steve, is you don't have to own the textbook to access the videos. So some people may just want to watch the videos.
Exactly. Who cares how they get the information? If they want to learn without looking at the textbook, just go to the videos. It's every chapter is covered, again, faithfully following the text with all the figures. So you can learn it without the textbook.
Wow, that's interesting. Well, Steve, I want to pull the curtain back just a little bit here and help people understand your creative process. How is it that you go about updating the book?
Well, it's kind of like you never stop writing it,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that the field is always changing. You're tracking all the things that are occurring, and you try to figure out which are the most well-established enough to include. So that's the first process, is trying to figure out what to include. But the creative process is also how to include it. One of my big secrets has been to make sure my artist understands it well enough to draw it.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting enough, if I understand it, that's the first stage. Well, I have to go through material sometimes several times to understand it. And that's why, in some ways, this video series is just another iteration of that. But the creative process starts with mastery on my part of the material that I'm trying to simplify.
Mm-hmm.
And then the simplification goes through a filter. It's known as Nancy Muntner, my artist.
Yes.
So I say, I'll even give her a crude sketch, which we always laugh about how terrible they are, and say, this is what I'm trying to show, say, what is the agitation pathway?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if I can't explain in words or in crude drawings sufficiently for her to understand it, she can't draw it, and I'm never going to be able to put it in the book because it will be poorly presented. So part of the creative process is dealing with a very bright artist that is more interested in the visual representation of things. And if I can get through to her, then there's a fighting chance that it's explained well enough to be easy. It's not that people can't understand complicated stuff. We all see that in particularly medical articles, and some textbooks are written very densely. The issue is to make it easy and quick because people are busy and they're tired.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's not to say they couldn't master it if it was harder. The issue is I'm trying to serve those people who are interested in the material but have a limited amount of time, and also they're tired. They're working hard. And so making it easy and even a little bit fun, and Nancy even put some whimsy into some of the figures to make you smile a bit. So the creative process is to simplify and then to visualize and to make sure that people can master it quickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, wait a minute, Steve. We have to back the tape up a little bit. Did you say that you don't get things on the first read-through? You have to go over them again and again, more than once?
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Yeah, I mean, that's the point, is that nobody gets stuff the first time. And when something's really very difficult to me, one of the ways that I've done it is to read it 3 times without actually trying to go back. As I'm reading and I'm not understanding part of it, I just power through the explanation. Then I go find somebody else who's explained it, often in a different way. And then by the time I see it 3 times, there's been enough overlap that I get those parts where they agree, and then I begin to be able to put it together. So also, I have to see something before I can understand it. I'm a visual learner, so I have my crude sketches, and if I can actually put it on paper, and then, of course, pretty it up with professional artists like Nancy Muntner, then, I've mastered it. And the other thing is teaching it. Boy, if you've ever been in a position where you had to learn something, it's one thing to learn it, and that's another thing to teach what you've learned. because you know it a heck of a lot better because you're on the spot. So when I've had PhD students in the past, they said, I want to learn about serotonin and OCD. I said, fine, you're going to give a seminar on this in 6 weeks. They said, well, no, I don't know anything about it. You have to teach me. I said, I'll do that, but you're going to have to master this enough to teach it to your colleagues. Well, boy, does people scramble because they need to master it. They don't want to be made a fool out of it. So I'm an active teacher. So teaching forces you to actually master stuff because kids and adults are too darn smart to actually fake it and try to, wing it. If you got to know the material or else you're going to be exposed. And so teaching is a good way to learn.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. There's the old saw, the old dictum, see one, do one, teach one. That's really true to some degree. Okay, so Steve, I'm going to pull the curtain back even further here. What would you say you've learned during the filming of this series, besides don't film too many episodes all at once, of course, and kill yourself? What else do you think you've learned here?
Well, we've had really an amazing reaction to the early release of some of these things, and it's really hitting the spot with some people. Mm-hmm. And what I've learned is that it's a for some people a delightful way of going through things one more time. And maybe what it is the hors d'oeuvre. You're intimidated by a book or you don't like books, but then after you've seen it, it makes people want to go through the book and read it. Or if they've actually looked at the book and they really, like I told you have to go through it again. Mm-hmm. So a better way to go through it might be to hear somebody talk about the same pictures that you just read about. Mm-hmm. So I find it as just like a one more dimension of presentation. So I had visual pictures and text, but now we've got video series. So there's 3 major presentations of the same materials.
Now, is this the concept I've heard of called programmed learning?
Right. Programmed learning is the way adults remember things. We don't really, in some ways, want people to learn. It's a nasty secret, I'll tell you. We want them to change their behavior. Mm-hmm. In other words, everybody who looks at this kind of material is pretty much an active clinician. And so we want them to change their diagnosing and prescribing behaviors to be updated and accurate and excellent. So to do that, you not only have to learn and remember and master, you have to get to the point of having confidence, because nobody changes behavior without confidence. And so the only way you're going to get confidence is with really programmed learning. The brain likes small multiples, so you have to break things down and repeat them and find delightful ways to repeat it, or else you won't repeat it because it's just a kind of a drudgery if you're not careful. The same thing the same way is terrible. So repetition, and the other thing is interaction, which is why being in seminars or having teachers is yet another way to do this. Because being able to ask questions and hear your peers talk is another way to get information in so deep and so amazing and so mastered that you're now confident and you're going to now go out and use a drug in a different way, or, drug that you've never used before or whatever, diagnosed a little differently because you're confident. And then you change your behavior and become a better clinician. So to do that, you have to use tricks. And tricks are, ways through the material. And I mentioned this earlier, that the easiest way through the material might be to first just pick the book up and look at the pictures. And then if you really want to learn it, you're going to have to read the text while you're looking at the pictures. Mm-hmm. And then you might even be masochistic enough to listen to at least some selected lectures, or at least looking at some of the lectures on certain slides. If there's a certain part of a chapter you don't understand, you don't have to go through the whole thing. You just have to go to the menu and read, like I say, about norepinephrine reuptake or about mixed features of depression, whatever it is, and just look at those things. And it's very efficient. And then if you do that, one of the interesting things is how rapidly it comes back into memory when you just look at the pictures again. And so you have to actually experience that to actually know what I'm talking about. But people who do that, feel empowered. Empowered means confident. And what we're trying to do is make people better, diagnosers and prescribers.
Right. So it's not just about learning something. It's about being able to implement it and change your behavior, as you said.
Absolutely.
And then use the principles to get better at what you're doing. You know, Steve, listening to you, and I'm just thinking, I don't know if the audience realizes what an innovator you've been in the field of medical education. And, you know, you and Rick Davis wrote that now a classic book, Best Practices for Medical Educators. It was published in 2009. And it seems to me you're sort of doing it again here. And one of the ways you've innovated, of course, is by it's something that sounds so simple to me now, but incorporating principles of adult education, how adults actually learn.
Well, it's a sad fact, Andy, and you and I both know that of the three major components of a learning environment, which includes the content, the speaker, and the audience, or the participants, if you want to call them that, in medicine, it's traditionally been content is king.
That's right.
Because there are so much content out there, and it's so important, yet how could anything be any more important than that? And furthermore, more content is better. So 100 pieces of content is better than 90, is better than 50. And so, by the way, the second most important thing in that triumvirate is the speaker. We have to be nice to the speaker. We have to be convenient to who or his or her time is. We have to, make sure that they're glorified and so forth, because they are the deliverer of the content. The least important person is the participant. And in medicine, too often they say, look, you wouldn't be in this if you weren't smart. So, suck it up and figure it out for yourself. I'm not going to make it easier for you. And if you don't get it, who cares? You shouldn't be in this field, and go away. It's a kind of arrogance that you have seen so often in your teaching. It really sets things on its head to just have a different attitude, to say, look, the most important is the participant, because we're serving that participant. And just think about it. If you serve, 100 people who each see 100 patients, how many influences have you had? It's the multiplier effect is amazing when you're talking about people who are diagnosing and prescribing. So being able to empower them in their short period of time when they have time pressure and they're tired is to actually make it easy and even fun, so they want to learn and be better. And you use all these principles of adult education to figure out, how do people learn? How do they do it efficiently? How do they, remember it with the least amount of effort? And how do they get enough confidence so they actually change their behavior rapidly and not have to go through it, every year for 3 times, and then after 3 years you change your behavior. Yeah. And that's not that hard. I mean, these principles are out there. They're just not used in medicine because medicine's gotten away with being content focused. And by the way, if you remember 10% of 100 items or 50% of 50 items, who's further ahead? And the reality is that, we keep wanting to get 102 items, 107 items, right. More is better. But the reality is that it's only good for the lecturer and the content. You say, well, I gave the content out. They don't remember it. Well, it's their problem.
Right.
But the reality is that if you were smart, you would say, I'd rather have them learn 25 pieces that they're going to retain and actually then give the other half another time, because we want them to master it. And that's too often not done.
Yeah. It's certainly true, and I love the concept you're talking about of going viral almost. We all as clinicians want to help the individual patients in front of us, but boy, you're right. If you can educate hundreds of providers who treat thousands of patients, you're going viral, and you're going to really have a bigger impact.
And going viral, it's interesting you use that term. I have actually seen the power of mastery in a person. There's nothing more motivating than someone who puts some effort into learning something new, then they get it. Because, a lot of times it's presented in a way in which you say, oh my gosh, this is so difficult content. And oh my gosh, that presenter is so smart. I could never be like him or her, and they get demoralized. If instead you say, oh my God, I get it. I'm going to do something with this. I'm so motivated and excited. And so, exciting people changes behavior as well. So, it's very much fun to see that happen in people, and that's really what you're trying to do.
Yeah, completely agree. And, it seems to me you've kind of done it again here with the video series. There are different learning styles. People learn differently, and you're just giving them more tools and more options here.
Yeah, and that's part of the respect of different ways of doing things. Some people learn differently, and forcing them all to learn the same way is a form of either insensitivity or arrogance. And we need to serve the participants. What does the participant need? And then they need information, they need updates, they need to change their behavior. So how are you going to serve them so they can do that? And the answer is different ways of material being presented and delightful ways of repeating it so they get that mastery and they get to that point, oh my gosh, I get it.
So do you recommend for teachers, people who are trying to teach this stuff, do you recommend the video series or the textbook or both? Or how would you use the two tools here?
Well, the reality is people skip lectures or miss lectures or get part of it. So the lectures are at a minimum a backup. So you can say, that's always available. The teacher can also use them even in the live presentation by, just going to the website and clicking on, like, say, I just told you about GABA. Let's hear it again. And let's hear how Stahl presents the same material. So 7 slides on GABA. It just is another way to repeat it right there in front of the person. And once you actually lead them to the digital stuff, they're more likely to go on their own later on, on their own. And so they say that I like that or I don't like that. And other people just want to read pictures. And again, I always joke with Nancy, my book is full of words, and she says, no, it's full of pictures. And actually, I hate to say it, she's right. So a lot of people just read pictures and the captions. That's all they have to do. And so who cares how they get the information and how they understand it? Once they understand it, you're done.
Yeah. Old fogies like you and me still like books. We still read books, but a lot of people now they read their things digitally. So I'm assuming the textbook is going to be available digitally as well.
Yes, it's on this thing called Stahl Online. Okay. Which is all my text. There's now 70 books, if you can believe it, in this series. Some of them are taken off because they're earlier editions. So I don't know, maybe there's 40 of them. So they are all online, and you can read them online. You can just consult them online, as a reference source. But it's interesting, this, what was it, 1600s that Gutenberg invented the printing press and the book?
That's right. Yeah.
This is a technology, it would have been called in those days. A book is a technology. And it's interesting, if you have a too big one that is a doorstop, then that's what it gets used for. So one of the things I learned is that when I went actually from the 3rd edition to the 4th, the first edition was doubled for the second. The 3rd edition was doubled on the second. The 4th edition was 50%, and the 5th edition is the same or a little bit less. So if you keep doubling things, you're going to do that content thing I told you not to do. It's too much content.
That's right.
And so keeping it low and manageable and having something that's a couple of pounds that you can hand, 500 pages is about all you can put in a book these days, and have anybody have a chance to actually read it.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, Steve, what was your favorite chapter to film of the ones you did, and why?
Well, in some ways it might have been psychosis because of all of the cool things that are happening to explain the circuitry and how we can intervene at neurotransmitter nodes in the network of psychosis and actually cause antipsychotic effects. So that was pretty cool. I enjoyed the Alzheimer chapter too because of the going towards the symptomatic treatment of psychosis and agitation, which is brand new stuff. So those are pretty good. I like that.
Yeah, sounds great. Psychopharmacology is complicated. It's not necessarily an easy subject to study. What would you recommend as some best learning strategies? What do you think would be the best way for people to pursue this?
Well, it depends on whether you already know neuroscience or not. So the best strategy is get your vocabulary. You're going to have a language that's going to be used to explain all this stuff. In my book, it's the first 3 chapters. It doesn't matter. If you know a little bit about chemical neurotransmission, you know something about there are 7 classes of targets. That's all. And really 3 or 4 of them are most of the targets for the psychotropic drugs that we have. Mm-hmm. So if you want to say there's about 200 psychotropic drugs that hit 7 targets, well, you have to know what those targets are and what the difference is between, let's say, a voltage-gated ion channel and a ligand-gated ion channel, or a transporter, or a G protein, so forth and so on. So if you know that stuff, then you can get started. Otherwise, you're going to get buried real quick because you don't have the vocabulary. So learn some neuroscience. I try to make it less painful. Actually, in earlier books, like the third edition, I actually had 8 chapters in neuroscience, which is overkill. We only have 3. And you can get this from other textbooks. Once you know neuroscience, a little bit about how the brain works, then you're ready to start. Mm-hmm. And then I think the idea would be to think about your practice and patients and always look for case examples that demonstrate the principles that we're talking about. And we're really talking about what is the mechanism of the disease, and therefore, what is the mechanism of the drug, and how do those two mechanisms interact? So we're really talking about vocabulary first, then understanding the disease state second. Mm-hmm. And once you understand the disease state with the vocabulary of neuroscience, you can understand the mechanism of action of the drug.
One of the things that's been really fascinating to me is there's certainly these basic building blocks of neuroscience you talked about, but things are changing, and we have to continuously update our own knowledge base. For instance, you talked about the TAR1 system, these trace amine-associated receptors. I mean, those were only discovered in the 1990s, I believe. I mean, so we're even learning about new neurotransmitter systems all the time.
Absolutely, and that is why you have to keep up, because if you're going to soon, I think it's going to be possible to prescribe a TAR1 agonist. What the heck is a TAR1 agonist, and what are trace amines? I mean, maybe you can just do it blindly and say, well, it works, and so I don't care how it works, and just look at the dose and call it a day. Those are people who have lost their zest and their basic, their pride and their really empowerment in the field, and they're missing the fun of being, understanding how to really tailor the treatment of a specific drug to the disease state of that individual patient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is almost like a detective story, trying to figure out, solve the mystery and figure out the clues and everything.
I'm just working on a slide set today, and you've heard me say it before. In my old age, I regret not having in some ways spent some time as a CSI for the FBI, a crime scene investigator. So instead, I have decided to become a CNSI. I go to the scene of the crime, which is the brain circuit that's involved, and investigate it and try to unravel it as a mystery. And so a central nervous system investigator is what we all can be, and approach it from that kind of fascinating point of view. What's wrong with this patient? How come they're not obeying the rules? How come they're not responding the right way? How come they have this extra symptom, which is not normally part of the disorder? Why is it not responding? So go to the scene of the crime, figure it out.
Yeah, and along the same lines, I can still vividly remember when I first heard about using antipsychotics for mood disorders, and I just thought that was so wacky. But if you're open-minded to thinking about these things differently, you can even think about creative ways to use the medicines we have.
I didn't use this in my book, but maybe I'll write an editorial about it. What you're talking about, Andy, right here is the DDDD. Mm-hmm. Different dose, different drug.
I like it.
And so, the so-called atypical antipsychotic actions of D2 antagonism are one thing, but at moderate doses, there are other receptors, and each of the drugs in this class has a different portfolio of those things. And if you lower the drug dose so that it's not blocking a lot of D2 receptors, it stops having antipsychotic actions. But at about half the dose, usually, not always, but lesser dose, you can have bipolar depression results, for example. And those are due to the non-D2 receptors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really remarkable, though. I mean, that's understanding these concepts. I've certainly, I don't know about you, but as I go around lecturing, I'm sure you have this experience too. I learn things from the audience all the time. They'll come up to me and either ask me a super challenging question that I have to look something up, or they'll teach me something that they've tried. And there's a lot of research that goes on out there in the hinterland, Steve.
I completely agree. And if I haven't learned something from an audience, I haven't been listening. And that's actually the major motivation these days to talk to audiences. One of the big things I've missed in Zoom, since you don't really get good chats and a lot of times these are more almost semi-apologetic, shy people coming up after the talk and telling you something that you learn. And I completely agree that some of the innovations, this is why drugs that come on the market sometimes have their best indications second and third. And that's from people that are using the drugs and notice anecdotally some unexpected finding. And it's that finding which then makes the most impact of that medicine. So we need to listen all the time. And if you stop learning from your audiences, you should stop teaching.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That's a good point. What do you think are some of the major takeaways that clinicians will find valuable from the video series?
I think that they can, with little effort, get the material on demand when they want it. You can't always get a lecture on demand, and we're trying to make these 30, 35-minute lectures bite-sized so that they're digestible and that they can be repeated easily. Or you can just take parts of the lecture again and look at what's called a teaching set and deconstruct that 30-minute lecture into 7 or 8 5-minute things about each of the topics within that lecture and just listen to less than 35 minutes. People are busy. So I think that that's really what it has to offer, in addition to the usual way of the 1600s, 17th century technology known as a book. You can do that too.
Very good. And what would you say you're most proud of in the video series?
I am most proud that I actually resisted the temptation to edit the slides. You and I have done a lot of lectures, and when somebody gives you a slide set or you go to a lecture, you're adding things at the last minute, you're changing the order, you're deleting things, and that completely flummoxes an audience. And so the discipline to actually say, be quiet, a few things have changed since you've written the book, so you want to put them in or revise them. But then they wouldn't faithfully follow the text. So I resisted that temptation. And I think that I'm most proud of the fact that this helps the program learning element of what is more important than some of those specific nuances of content that make me as the speaker maybe a little more comfortable with the content. Hey, Stahl, it's not about you. It's about the person watching the video.
Yeah, so it really comes back again to being participant or learner focused, back to our principles of adult education. And I don't know if the audience realizes this, Steve, but you were actually the first person to use audience response technology in any medical meeting, not just psychiatry or CNS, but any medical meeting.
Well, it was interesting. Rick Davis at the time was not working with me in medicine. He's the co-author of the book you mentioned about adult learning principles. Mm-hmm. And he was working actually for things like the auto industry. Mm-hmm. And I went to one of his programs, with my arrogant medical idea, thinking, what can I possibly learn from a program that's to people that often have a high school education? And, I didn't think that they actually had very difficult content. But they did a weekend course, and these salespeople had to know the difference between this year's Camry and last year's Camry, and also the competitor Ford and the Datsun Nissan, and they had to know it by Monday because they're going back to work. And they were using this principles of pre-test, then a lecture that had repetition, and then post-test. And then the pre-post comparisons, you could actually both evaluate how much learning had occurred, but you know what else you could evaluate? How much teaching occurred. Because if the audience doesn't improve from their knowledge base, whose fault is that? And so it really struck me as being a tremendously innovative way to teach. And it was brought from really corporate training into medicine by me, I guess. I just stole it. You know what they say? Clever invents, genius steals. So I stole it.
I like that. Well, then you certainly are quite a genius. It's amazing you haven't been caught and thrown in jail yet for all of your genius.
Yeah, there we go.
All right. Well, I've really enjoyed talking with you about this, Steve. And basically what we're talking about for the audience here is the video series that you filmed to accompany the new version, the 5th edition of your textbook, Essentials of Psychopharmacology. And I think this is just a wonderful option for students, learners, and educators who can use this to help educate folks. And again, just to remind people, these videos can be accessed in the NEI, on the NEI website in the members portal. So you do have to be an NEI member. It's one of the benefits of being an NEI member. and you don't have to own the textbook. But it sounds like, Steve, the idea here is that they are complementary and you can use them both together. Is that correct? But you don't have to.
Yeah, and even simultaneously, I think some people might enjoy just following the pictures as I speak, so that then, when they get ready to read it, it's already somewhat familiar.
Yeah, that really makes sense. Well, Steve, you have really been quite an innovator in the medical education field, and I think you've done it again. I want to thank you so much for doing that and for this wonderful discussion.
Well, thanks for the kind words. It's been great being able to talk about it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you to the audience, too. Hope you found this helpful. And stay tuned for the other podcasts we're doing in this series. This is, of course, the Psychopharmacology podcast series. And we're right now in episode 2 of a 3-part series, really highlighting the latest version of Essentials of Psychopharmacology, the 5th edition. Thanks so much for listening, and take care.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the NEI Podcast. Please let us know what you'd like to hear more about by leaving a review. Don't miss another episode. Subscribe today.